More than 20 million households in the United States are already millionaires. Not celebrities, not tech founders, not lottery winners, just ordinary people, teachers, engineers, small business owners, office workers. Which raises a strange question. If millions of completely ordinary people have already reached $1 million in net worth, why do most people never get there? Two people can start their careers at the same time, earn similar salaries, and live in the same city. Yet 40 years later, one quietly becomes a millionaire, while the other is still worrying about retirement. And the strange part is that the difference rarely comes down to intelligence, luck, or even income. It comes down to a handful of financial habits most people barely notice while they're happening. And once you start noticing those habits, you begin to see why the path to $1 million quietly splits for different people. For most people, the path to $1 million doesn't collapse because of one dramatic financial mistake. It disappears in a much quieter way. Small decisions that seem completely harmless in the moment. Ordering food instead of cooking because the day was long. Upgrading a phone that still works perfectly well. Signing up for subscriptions that feel inexpensive individually. None of these decisions look dangerous. In fact, they barely feel like financial decisions at all. They feel like convenience, comfort, small rewards after working hard. And that's exactly why they're so easy to repeat. Over time, these tiny choices slowly become part of everyday life. A few dollars here, a small upgrade there, nothing that feels big enough to worry about. But something subtle begins happening in the background, and most people don't notice it until decades later. The gap between what someone earns and what they keep slowly starts to disappear. And that gap is the only space where wealth can actually grow. Without it, even a very good salary struggles to turn into long-term financial security. Which creates a strange situation. Many people work hard for decades, earn respectable incomes, and still reach their 50s or 60s wondering where the $1 million went. Here's where the numbers start to get interesting. Because while the idea of becoming a millionaire feels distant for many people, the financial reality in the United States tells a very different story. According to data from the Federal Reserve's Survey of Consumer Finances, the median retirement savings for Americans between the ages of 55 and 64 is roughly $185,000. That's the stage of life when many people are approaching retirement. And while $185,000 is certainly not nothing, it's still very far from the $1 million milestone that many people assume they'll eventually reach. So the question becomes obvious. If millions of households have already crossed the $1 million mark in net worth, why do so many people arrive near retirement with only a fraction of that amount? The answer usually isn't a single bad decision. It's something more gradual, a pattern that slowly shapes financial outcomes over decades. Research from institutions like Vanguard and Fidelity consistently shows that long-term wealth is driven less by income and more by three quiet variables: how early someone starts investing, how consistently they continue investing, and how large the gap remains between what they earn and what they spend. At first glance, these factors may not look dramatic, but over long periods of time, they begin to behave like multipliers. Small differences early in life can quietly grow into massive differences decades later. Two people might start their careers earning similar salaries. Yet, if one person begins investing just a few years earlier, or consistently saves a slightly larger percentage of their income, the long-term outcome can look completely different. And this is where the path toward $1 million quietly begins to split. Not because one person suddenly becomes wealthy, but because small financial systems start compounding in one direction, while everyday spending habits compound in the other. At first glance, becoming a millionaire seems like a financial milestone that requires something dramatic: a huge salary, a lucky investment, or some extraordinary career success. But when researchers actually study how ordinary people build wealth over time, the pattern looks very different. Most millionaires do not reach that milestone through one big moment. They reach it through a system, a quiet financial system that runs in the background of their lives for decades. Instead of relying on occasional financial discipline, they create structures that automatically move money toward long-term investments. Saving becomes automatic, investing becomes consistent, and spending gradually stays below what their income could comfortably support. Over long periods of time, this system begins to create something incredibly powerful: compounding, money that starts producing more money. At first, the results look small, but eventually the system reaches a turning point where growth accelerates. And once that turning point arrives, the path toward $1 million becomes far more predictable than most people expect. Which means the real question isn't whether someone earns an extraordinary income. The real question is whether they build a system that allows wealth to quietly accumulate over time. When researchers look at the financial lives of ordinary millionaires, a few patterns appear again and again. And when those patterns are missing, reaching $1 million becomes much less likely. In fact, there are 4 reasons that quietly prevent most people from ever reaching that milestone. The first reason many people never reach $1 million is surprisingly simple. They start investing too late. At the beginning of a career, income often feels too small to invest seriously. There are student loans, rent, transportation, and the basic costs of building adult life. So many people tell themselves something very reasonable. They'll start investing later. Later, when income is higher. Later, when life feels more stable. But here's the problem: compounding doesn't wait for stability. Time is the single most powerful factor in long-term investing. For example, someone who invests $500 per month starting at age 25, earning an average return of around 8%, could end up with roughly $1.3 million by age 65. But something interesting happens if that same person waits just 10 years. Starting at 35 instead of 25 dramatically changes the outcome. Those 10 missing years can mean hundreds of thousands of dollars lost to time. Because in investing, time isn't just helpful. Time is the engine that makes the system work. And when those early years pass without money entering the system, reaching $1 million later becomes dramatically harder. The second reason many people never reach $1 million has nothing to do with investing knowledge. It has to do with how income changes over time. For most professionals, earnings gradually increase throughout their careers. Raises happen, promotions appear, opportunities improve. But something interesting tends to happen alongside that income growth. Spending quietly grows as well, not in dramatic ways, in subtle ones. A slightly nicer neighborhood, more convenience in everyday life, services and subscriptions that slowly become normal. Each change feels small, and that's exactly why they're easy to ignore. But over the course of 20 or 30 years, those small increases can absorb nearly every dollar of additional income. Which creates a strange situation. Someone earning $120,000 per year may feel just as financially stretched as someone earning $60,000 because their expenses expanded at the same pace as their income. And when income rises, but saving rates stay the same, the path toward $1 million becomes much slower than people expect. The third reason many people never reach $1 million comes from 2 of the largest financial decisions most adults make: housing and transportation. In the United States, these 2 categories often consume the biggest portion of household income. A slightly larger home, a newer car with a monthly payment. On their own, these choices rarely seem extreme. In fact, they often feel like natural steps as income rises and life progresses. But here's where the numbers become surprising. A household spending $1,000 more per month on housing and vehicles may barely notice the difference at first. After all, it's just part of the monthly budget. But $1,000 per month is $12,000 per year. Over 30 years, that becomes $360,000. And something even more interesting happens when investing enters the picture. If that same $1,000 per month were invested at an average return of around 8%, it could grow to more than $1.4 million. which means the difference between a slightly larger house or a newer car and a modest alternative isn't just lifestyle. It can quietly determine whether someone reaches the $1 million milestone at all. The fourth reason many people never reach $1 million has less to do with discipline and more to do with structure. Many people treat saving and investing as something they'll do if money is left at the end of the month. But in reality, there is rarely money left over. Expenses expand, unexpected costs appear, and saving becomes something that gets postponed again and again. Wealth tends to grow much more reliably when the process becomes automatic, and this is where financial systems begin to matter. In the United States, this often happens through things like 401k retirement plans. Money is invested automatically before someone even sees it in their bank account, which removes the need to constantly make the decision to save. And over time, those automatic contributions begin to build momentum. For example, investing $500 per month into diversified index funds, earning around 8% annually, could grow to over $1 million in about 35 years, not through extraordinary investment skill, but simply because the system keeps running year after year. And this is one of the quiet differences between people who eventually reach $1 million and those who do not. One group relies on occasional financial discipline. The other relies on systems that continue working even when life gets busy. The interesting thing about reaching $1 million is that it rarely happens through one dramatic financial decision. For most people who eventually reach that milestone, the process looks surprisingly ordinary. They start investing earlier than most. They keep a gap between what they earn and what they spend. They avoid locking themselves into expenses that absorb their income. And most importantly, they build systems that keep investing automatically for decades. At first, those systems rarely look impressive. A few $100s per month, an automatic contribution to a retirement account, a habit that quietly runs in the background of everyday life. But over long periods of time, those small systems begin to compound in ways that feel almost disproportionate to the effort. For example, someone who consistently invests $500 per month into diversified index funds, earning an average return of around 8%, could eventually build a portfolio worth more than $1 million. Not because they earned an extraordinary income, but because time was allowed to do its work, which means the real difference between people who reach $1 million and those who never do often comes down to something surprisingly simple. Small financial systems started early and allowed to run long enough for compounding to take over.